The dark cloud of one of the worst crimes in British history still hangs over Liverpool like a shroud.
2-year-old James was last seen over 48 hours ago outside this butcher's shop in a Bootle arcade. Security cameras photographed his apparent abduction by 2 youths.
A murder made so sickening because the killers were children themselves.
Hi friends, and welcome. This is Crime Corner with Jen, and for those of you who don't know, my name is Jen and I talk about true crime cases on this channel. If you enjoy my content, please be sure to like, subscribe, and to turn on the notification bell so that you don't miss out on any of my future videos. Before we jump into the details of this case, I do want to give you guys a warning or a heads up that this is going to be a pretty heavy one. We do talk about a few sensitive matters in this video, so just please keep that in mind and watch your own discretion. As you may have already gathered from the title of my YouTube video and in my introduction, today's video is going to be about the shocking and tragic case of 2-year-old James Bulger. This crime takes place in Liverpool, England, and up until today, this is a case that has not been forgotten because it's honestly so chilling and so barbaric and devastating that it really shook the entire nation to its core. This is one of those cases where if you're hearing it for the first time, which was me like a few weeks ago, you're kind of just like, what? Like, how did this happen? And how could it have happened? Because the details of it, or just the actual crime itself, it's just almost unbelievable that something like this could have actually happened in real life. And you'll understand why I say that when I walk you guys through the details of the case. James Patrick Bulger was born on March 16th, 1990 in Kirkby, England. James did have one older brother, and at the time of his disappearance, his parents were expecting a third child. So that would make James the middle child, and they were expecting a younger sibling. James was often described as a lively and friendly toddler. He was known for his bubbly personality and bright blue eyes, and he was so loved and doted on by both of his parents. On Friday, February 12th, 1993, Denise would decide to visit their downtown shopping center, and she would bring James along with her for the afternoon. They would arrive at the New Strand shopping center and head down to a butcher shop in one of the lower levels. Denise would gather all the things she needed for that day's grocery shopping run and would begin checking out at the cash register. While paying for her shopping, Denise would end up needing to let go of her son's hand. And just moments after, she would develop this sinking feeling in her stomach as she realized that her son was no longer beside her. She begins frantically searching for James inside of the butcher shop, but he's not there, so she runs outside into the middle of the center of the shopping complex, and he's not there either. She even goes into the different shops in that area and asks if anyone's seen her son, but he's nowhere to be found. James has vanished, and he's now missing. Denise would contact the authorities, and an immediate search would begin for her 2-year-old son. Police would scour the shopping mall and the surrounding areas. However, they would make a puzzling discovery when reviewing the CCTV footage taken within the shopping center. The footage would show James being approached by 2 young boys. These boys would take James's hand, and they would lead him straight out of the shopping center. The image of the 2 young boys taking James's hand and walking him out of the shopping center looked innocent enough to all the other people shopping in the area, but it would turn out to be far from the true reality of the situation. The bystanders who had witnessed this scene just assumed that the 2 older boys were related to James and that they were his brothers, but they weren't. They were his abductors. And they were 2 10-year-old boys by the name of John Venables and Robert Thompson. So when the authorities had pinpointed the exact moment that James had been taken from the shopping center by those two older boys, they would end up releasing the still images from the CCTV footage that they were reviewing to the public. They had hoped that by doing this, somebody would be able to recognize the two boys in the image and would be able to step up and provide them with any sort of useful information that would lead them to finding James. Denise and Ralph at this point had even made numerous pleas to the public for the safe return of their child. But just 2 days after his disappearance, the couple's already nightmare situation would go from worse to just absolutely terrifying. Now, before I talk about the next part of this video, I just want to give you guys another disclaimer that the details that we're going to be talking or discussing in this section of the video is just going to be incredibly difficult to hear. So if you're going to proceed, please just keep that in mind and proceed at your own discretion. After leaving the busy shopping center, the two older boys would lead James on a 4-kilometer walk across Liverpool. Their first stop was at the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, which was about 400 meters from the shopping center. And it was here that they would start taunting James and making jokes about pushing him into the canal. They would then also pick James up, and for whatever horrifying reason, they would drop him, leading to several injuries to his head and to his face. And while they were at this canal, a witness did come forward to say that they had seen James with these two other boys and that James looked distressed. According to this witness, James was, and I quote, crying his eyes out. However, it's unclear to me whether this witness ended up going up to the boys and seeing what the situation was, but regardless of whether they did or they did not, the two boys still continued on their way with James. What's shocking to me is that throughout their 4-kilometer walk across Liverpool, James would be seen with these two older boys by 38 different people. Tabloids would even dub these witnesses as the Liverpool 38. Now, apparently, only 2 out of the 38 witnesses would intervene when they saw James with John and Robert. They saw how distressed James was. He was crying his eyes out the entire time, and he had injuries on his face. So out of concern, they did go up and they did try to intervene. So they would stop the 3 boys in their tracks and they would ask the older boys, like, hey, what's going on here? The 2 older boys would tell the witnesses 2 stories, 2 different stories. To one witness, they would tell them that James was their younger brother and that they were just trying to get him home. And then to the other witness, they would tell them that they had found James and James was lost. So they were on their way to the police station and they were gonna take him there and then have the police help find his family. But honestly, it's just so shocking to me that so many people saw these 3 boys and did nothing. 38 people saw these 3 boys and didn't do anything. Okay, well, 2 people did something. They stopped, they intervened, and they asked the boys, like, hey, what's going on? But at the end of the day, they still let these 2 boys go on their way with this toddler that looks very distressed and has all these injuries on his face. So eventually, the 3 boys would, after continuing on their way, they would arrive in Walton. And across the street from where they stood was the Walton Lane police station, and this is where the 2 older boys would stop and hesitate. Could that hesitation have been because they were contemplating whether or not they should move forward with their plans? Who knows? I'd like to think that they thought about it for a minute, that they stopped, and that some part of them was like, hey, no, this is wrong, and we should just drop him off at the police station and just not do anything like this ever again. But of course that doesn't happen. They would decide to lead James away from the police station and instead lead him towards a railway track. The track was near the Walton and Anfield railway station, and it was at this railway line that the 2 boys would begin carrying out the most horrifying deeds. Earlier that day, while the 2 older boys were at the shopping center where they had picked up James, they would shoplift this like blue paint, and while at this railway line, they would begin throwing it into James's left eye. They would then begin kicking and stomping James and throwing rocks and bricks at the poor child. Authorities would then also later discover that they had placed batteries in James's mouth, so they had shoved it into his mouth. And they also believe that the two older boys had shoved the batteries in other places of James's body. Then they would continue by dropping a 10-kilogram fish plate onto James's body. They didn't just do this once, they did it numerous times. And it would be later discovered that James had sustained 10 skull fractures from this 10-kilogram fish plate. Now, because there were so many severe injuries found head to toe on James's body, 42 to be exact, the authorities couldn't pinpoint exactly which of these injuries was the fatal blow. And now this leads us to the very last detail, and this one is really difficult for me to wrap my head around because it's just so devastating to know that this happened to a child. And when I first came upon this piece of information, I did debate whether or not I wanted to add it in this video, but it is a significant part to this case, so here it is. The two older boys, after doing all of those horrific things to James, they would decide that, okay, like in order to not get caught, we'll just make it look like it was an accident. So they would decide to take James's body and they would basically drag him over the railway tracks and they would leave him there. They had hoped that a train would soon come by and essentially just make it look like James had been hit accidentally while playing on this railway track. So they would leave his body there. And indeed, a train would later come by and James's body would be dismembered by the train's impact. His body would then be discovered 2 days later by a group of young children playing in that area. A combination of CCTV footage as well as statements from witnesses that had seen James, Robert, and John on that day of James's disappearance would eventually lead to Robert and John's arrest. In fact, enhanced CCTV images of the boys had been presented on national TV, and a woman had recognized John. And luckily, the woman who had recognized John in the still image would remember that she had seen John playing with Robert in the area that James had gone missing from, and she would contact the police. Now, even with all of this evidence, like the still images of James, Robert, and John, it was still incredibly difficult for authorities to wrap their heads around what just happened. And honestly, not even just for the authorities, but for the entire nation. Initially, when seeing the CCTV footage of these two boys walking with James out of the busy shopping center, they did assume that the boys were maybe like pre-teen years or maybe like going into their teenage years. But it never once crossed their minds that these two boys would be 10 years old. So James's parents and the authorities would have to come to terms with the fact that James had been kidnapped and then brutally tormented and murdered by two 10-year-old boys. They were children. They weren't even teenagers yet. Like, they were so young, and I don't understand where the evilness came from. Detective Superintendent Albert Kirky, who was working on the case, would even make the following statement. "We thought, from what happened with the body, that it had to be the work of an adult. It was very difficult to get our minds around that potential situation that we could be dealing with two young boys. What's also really disturbing is that just before Robert's arrest, he and his older brother, again, I just want to clarify here quickly that John and Robert are not related. They were just friends. So Robert would go with his older brother to the railway station and they would lay flowers for the memorial made for James. And no one had a clue that the person who was responsible for what happened to James was there laying flowers at the poor child's memorial. Another detective that was working on James's case, a detective Sergeant Phil Roberts, would tell the reporters that when he heard that Robert was at the memorial for James, he just couldn't believe it. He had a difficult time believing that Robert was responsible for what happened because, for one, he was a child, and two, he was at this memorial acting completely fine. No one had a clue that he had just committed a horrible and just shocking crime. Detective Roberts would also note that when he had taken Robert in for questioning, Robert had just denied everything. He totally denied everything. He never showed any remorse during any stage of the interview. I understand Venables did. He acted whiter than white in the interview, and in many ways, he was very clever in a conniving, streetwise sort of way. But in the end, he shot himself in the foot by giving me a detailed account of what James Bulger was wearing. This is where we thought, we've got him, because no 10-year-old would remember what he was wearing in such detail unless they had to. Forensic testing would also show that the two boys had blue paint on their clothing, and the testing would confirm that it was the same exact blue paint that was found on James. Authorities also suspected that there may have been some sort of SA involved because, well, for one, James, when they found him, he was stripped down. He had his clothes removed, and on top of that, there were other indicators. But when authorities and psychiatrists asked the boys about this, they would be reluctant to provide any sort of details and would remain tight-lipped on it. In addition to the confession and the blue paint found on the boys' clothing, they would also find James's blood on one of their shoes. And at one point during Robert's interrogation, he would ask one of the detectives if James had been taken to the hospital to, and I quote, "get him alive again." So it's pretty clear that Robert and John had committed this crime. There is no doubt about it. It's just so shocking, again, that at their age, they were capable of doing such a horrendous thing. So on February 20th of 1993, both boys would be arrested and charged for the murder of James. They would then appear at South Sefton Youth Court on February 22nd, 1993, and would remain in custody until their trial began on November 1st, 1993. On the first day of their trial, so November 1st, 500 protesters had gathered outside the courthouse. This case was like one of the most sensational things to have happened in the 1990s in the UK, and everybody was watching. Everybody was outraged, everybody was shocked, and they wanted justice. Robert and John's families even had to move out of like the city and move to a different place and like change their identities because they were just receiving so many death threats for what their sons had done. And while both Robert and John's families were at the trial, Robert and John would be tried as adults, which meant that they weren't able to sit with their families during the entirety of the trial. They had to sit by themselves, not as children, but as adults. Some people even saw this as unfair. They believed that the court should have tried them as children because, well, they are children. They are 10 years old, right? But the court had seen them as two individuals who were capable of mischievous discretion, meaning an ability to act with criminal intent, because they were mature enough, even at the age of 10, to know that what they were doing to James was seriously wrong. Neither one of the boys would end up speaking during the trial, and the case built against them was entirely based on witness statements, as well as over 20 hours of interrogation tape recordings. And throughout the trial, the boys and their lawyers would deny the charges of murder and abduction. In fact, the interrogation tapes would show that the boys had blamed one another for the crime. Their lawyers, because they had two separate lawyers, would also try to put forward statements telling the court that the other boy was much more disturbing and more evil than the other. What's really surprising to me is that when I was doing my research, I found out that the two boys were also being charged for attempted abduction. And of course, they would deny this, but this charge was due to the fact that on the same day that they had taken James, they had actually tried to take another child. And this was before they had taken James, but like on the same day, because they were loitering around at that shopping center. And apparently they had been doing that because they were looking for their victim. And they saw this boy with his mother and his sister, and they had tried to take the boy, but the mother caught on to what was going on. So she went and made sure that this didn't happen. So she prevented her son from being taken. That's when they saw James, and they realized that James was an easy target. So we all know what happened after that. But yeah, they had basically tried to steal another child that day, and they weren't successful, but they were being charged for attempted abduction for that. So the court did determine that Robert was probably the leader of this entire thing and that he was the one who had coordinated all the details. But they determined that it was John who had proposed the idea of taking James to the railway track. Honestly, it doesn't matter to me like who came up with this plan and who is the leader, because at the end of the day, both boys had participated in this atrocity and they were equally responsible. Now, on November 24th, 1993, Robert and John would be found guilty of their crimes. They were 11 years old at the time of the sentencing, so this would make them the youngest convicted murderers of the 20th century. The judge presiding over the case had stated that the two boys had committed a crime of, and I quote, "unparalleled evil and barbarity. In my judgment, your conduct was both cunning and very wicked." The judge would sentence the boys to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure with a recommended minimum sentence of 8 years. I'm not sure how the legal system in the UK works, but I am assuming that Her Majesty's pleasure basically means maybe the Queen's court gets to decide how long these boys are held in prison for. I don't know. For my British viewers, if you guys are seeing this and you know anything about it, please shed some light for us in the comments. But anyhow, there turns out to be a lot of debate about how much time the boys should spend in prison. First, it was 8 years, then it was 10 years, then it was 15, but then in the end, it ended up being 8 years, which was the recommended time duration that the judge had given out. So in the end, the boys would end up being released in 2001. Yes. These two boys who had murdered James Bulger were only detained for 8 years before being released in 2001. The parole board would determine that the two boys were no longer a threat to society. And because of that, they would be released on a lifelong license, which I believe, from my understanding, is that they're able to leave the prison, but they're gonna be on parole for basically the entirety of their lives. The boys were then apparently given new identities as well as moved to secret locations and placed in a witness protection style program. Because obviously there are a lot of people still very upset by what they've done, and the government didn't want to just put them out into the world because they would have likely just been killed by very angry people. So both of the boys, who are at this point men, were deemed stable enough for release because during their time in prison, they were put through rehabilitation. Oh my goodness, I can't pronounce the word. Rehabilitation. And they were also given an education. They both had apparently made really good progress during their time in detainment, and because of that, they were deemed safe to re-enter society. However, there were some terms set in place for their release. For one, they were forbidden to contact one another and were also forbidden to contact James's family. They were also forbidden to ever visit and to reside in the Merseyside region, which is where James's family resided. And if they ever breached any of these conditions, they would be sent back into prison. News media were also hit with an injunction which prohibited them from ever releasing details about Robert and John's location, as well as like specific details about their new lives. This was basically meant to ensure that their new identities and their new addresses weren't leaked to the public out of fear for their safety and well-being. Now, not too much is known about Robert and John to this day because obviously like the news media aren't allowed to release a lot of private information about them, and they do have new identities and are protected by the UK government. But what we do know is that Robert, since his release, has not gotten himself into any sort of other trouble. In fact, in 2006, there were reports that Robert was in a very stable and happy relationship with another man, and it's believed that that relationship is still going on today. There have also been reports that Robert's adjusted very, very well into the community that he's currently residing in. As for John, it seems he has not been as lucky. Right before his 2001 release, the then 17-year-old John was engaged in a relationship with a female employee at the unit that he was being held in. And her employment at that unit was immediately terminated after the relationship came to light. Then in March of 2002, John would go on to, well, this was after his release, he would go on to have a relationship with a single mother of 5 children, which he would for some reason later deny. After that relationship ended, he would begin having relationships with much younger women and then also abusing different substances. In September 2008, John would be arrested for taking part in a drunken fight, and then later that year he would be caught with on his physical body. He would then be released, but then in mid-2010, he would be arrested for the possession of child. And then he would be released in May of 2011, but then in 2017, he would be arrested once again for the same crime that he committed in 2010. Currently, it does look like John is still being held in custody. The parole board has decided that it's just easier to keep him in custody because if they release him out into the world again, then he's just going to give away his identity once again if given a new one, and that's just going to cost them even more money. The British government has reportedly spent £65,000 just to keep his identity a secret, and which he keeps ruining by pulling all of this crap. Now, his next parole hearing is happening November 2023, so this year, so let's see whether or not they're going to keep him in custody still or if they're just going to release him out into the world again. So let's talk a little bit about the aftermath for everybody. Understandably so, James's parents were just devastated by the outcome of the trial and outraged that Robert and James seemed to receive such a lenient sentence. Not only did they end up losing their child, but in the end, they would also end up losing their marriage. Denise and Ralph would end up divorcing just months after the trial concluded in 1993, but they would later end up remarrying and having children with their new spouses. You know, I can't even begin to imagine just what Denise and Ralph had to go through when all of that was happening. I mean, I can't even imagine what they're going through now. Yes, this happened in 1993, but they're going to have to live with the knowledge of what happened to their child, as well as the loss of their child for the rest of their lives. And not to mention knowing that their child's murderer is out in the world, like just living his life, and with the other one potentially also being released again after numerous arrests after his 2001 release. This does bring this case to a close, but I do want to know what you guys think about this case. Do you guys think that the British legal system has failed James and his family by allowing the release of John and Robert? Or do you guys think that they deserve some sort of leniency just because of how young they were when they committed this crime? Let me know what you guys think about this case, and as always, if you guys have any other case recommendations for me, please feel free to shoot them through to truecrime@gmail.com. And as always, I really appreciate you guys taking the time to tune into my videos and to leave your comments and to support me, and I really look forward to seeing you guys in my next video. Thank you so much and have a great week ahead. Bye!